The massive doors of the Galactic Assembly Hall groaned open as Jake Morrison walked through them for what he knew would be the last time. The human ambassador's boots clicked against the polished floor that had been walked on by representatives of 47 different species for over 2 centuries. Today felt different, though. Today, the air itself seemed to crackle with tension and barely contained rage. Jake took his place at the small human delegation table near the back of the chamber. The positioning wasn't an accident. 3 years ago, when humanity first joined the Galactic Assembly, they had been given seats in the front row as honored new members. Each year since then, their table had been moved further back as accusations mounted and trust eroded. Now they sat in the shadows while species that had never left their home systems enjoyed places of honor. Near the speaking platform, Lisa Grant sat beside him, checking her data pad for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. The lieutenant commander's jaw was so tight Jake could see the muscle twitching beneath her skin. She had been part of the human delegation since the beginning, and had watched their status decline with each passing month. What started as minor trade disputes had grown into systematic exclusion from galactic commerce. Human ships were banned from 14 major systems. Human citizens traveling alone were subject to what the Assembly politely called protective custody, but which everyone knew was imprisonment without trial. The Zephyrian Chancellor stepped up to the speaking platform with his flowing robes, billowing around his tall, thin frame. His species had been the driving force behind most of the anti-human legislation over the past year. Chancellor Vexthul cleared his throat with a sound like wind chimes in a storm before beginning to read from a scroll that seemed to shimmer with its own light. The Galactic Assembly has reached a decision regarding the human question, he announced, in his melodic voice that somehow managed to sound condescending, even when discussing the weather. After careful deliberation and extensive review of the evidence presented by member species, it has been determined that humanity poses an unacceptable risk to galactic peace and stability. Jake felt his hands curl into fists on the table surface. He had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud still hit like a physical blow. Around the chamber, alien representatives leaned forward in their seats with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to barely concealed glee. The Corithian trade minister was actually smiling with all 4 of his mouths. Therefore, the Chancellor continued, humanity's colonial rights in the Outer Rim territories are hereby revoked effective immediately. All human settlements beyond the Sol system boundary must be evacuated within 1 standard year. Human vessels are banned from approaching any Class A trading stations, and human citizens may not travel unescorted in civilized space. The chamber erupted in a chorus of alien sounds that Jake had learned to recognize. As approval over his years of service, the Naga representatives hissed their pleasure. The insectoid Vrex clicked their mandibles in rapid succession. Even the usually silent rock-like granite folk made grinding noises that passed for applause in their culture. Lisa leaned over to whisper in his ear, "Jake, we have to do something. They're talking about complete isolation." He nodded without taking his eyes off the Chancellor, who was clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. Vexthul raised one long-fingered hand and the chamber fell silent again. However, the Assembly recognizes that complete banishment might be seen as harsh by some members. Therefore, we offer humanity a final option. The Chancellor paused for dramatic effect while Jake felt his stomach drop. Nothing good ever followed that kind of pause in galactic politics. The Assembly has identified a suitable system in the Epsilon sector where humans may be relocated for the safety and security of all galactic citizens. This system contains 3 habitable worlds with adequate resources to support your population. You will be provided with transportation and basic supplies for the journey. In return, humanity agrees to permanent isolation from galactic affairs. The words hit Jake like a series of physical blows. Relocation, isolation. They were talking about putting humanity in a cage and throwing away the key. He looked around the chamber at faces that had once greeted him with respect, if not warmth. Now he saw only fear and disgust mixed with the satisfaction of a problem being solved. The ethereal Veiltar representative floated up from their section of the chamber. Their species communicated through pure thought projection, so when they spoke, everyone heard the words directly in their minds. This solution benefits all. The humans will be safe from their own aggressive tendencies, and the galaxy will be protected from their unpredictable nature. It is the most logical course of action. That was the final straw. Jake Morrison had served his species faithfully for 15 years. He had negotiated trade agreements that brought prosperity to human worlds. He had mediated disputes between alien species who refused to speak to each other directly. He had worked 18-hour days trying to build bridges between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. All of it was being swept away by fear and prejudice disguised as logical policy. He stood up slowly. The simple action seemed impossibly loud in the massive chamber. His chair scraped against the floor with a sound like fingernails on metal. Conversations died mid-sentence. Alien heads turned in his direction with expressions of curiosity and annoyance. Jake looked around the chamber one final time, taking in the faces of beings he had considered colleagues if not friends. The Altarian ambassador, who had shared drinks with him after successful negotiations, now looked away in embarrassment. The Wanderer Fleet representative, who had praised human ingenuity just months earlier, studied her clawed hands instead of meeting his eyes. "We are done," Jake said in a voice that carried clearly through the chamber despite being barely above a whisper. The simple statement hit the assembly like a thunderclap. Lisa immediately stood beside him, followed by the rest of the human delegation. Chief Science Officer Amy Carter closed her research files with a snap. Military liaison. Pete Collins straightened his uniform jacket and fixed the Chancellor with a stare that could have melted hull plating. Trade Representative Carol West gathered her proposals for expanded commerce agreements and dropped them in the waste disposal unit beside her chair. Lisa activated her emergency beacon, sending a coded message to every human ship in the system. The message was simple and had been prepared months earlier when it became clear which direction the political winds were blowing. 3 words that would change everything that followed. Come home now. The human delegation moved toward the exit in perfect formation. Years of working together had created an almost telepathic understanding between them. They walked with their heads high and their backs straight, showing no sign of the defeat the assembly expected to see. As they reached the massive doorway, the Carithian Trade Minister called out in his grating voice, "Where will you run now, little mammals?" "The galaxy is closed to you." Jake stopped walking. For a moment, Lisa thought he might turn around and say something diplomatic, something that would leave the door open for future negotiations. Something that would preserve what little relationship remained between humanity and the galactic community. Instead, Jake Morrison looked back over his shoulder at the assembled representatives of 46 species who had just voted to cage humanity like dangerous animals. "We're not running," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the massive chamber. "We're going home to prepare." The doors closed behind the human delegation with a sound like the sealing of a tomb. The Galactic Assembly sat in stunned silence as the implications of those final words sank in. They had expected pleas for mercy or desperate attempts at negotiation. They had received neither. What they had received instead was a promise that would haunt their dreams in the months to come. 3 months had passed since the human delegation walked out of the Galactic Assembly, and the silence from human space was becoming unnerving. Trade routes that had buzzed with human freighters carrying everything from exotic foods to rare minerals now sat empty except for the occasional automated beacon warning other ships away from human territory. The colonial worlds that had welcomed alien tourists and merchants with open arms became ghost towns for any non-human visitors. Zixcal, of the Naga Collective, slithered through the abandoned marketplace on New Denver, trying to gather intelligence for his report back to the homeworld. The Serpentine alien had been stationed on this Centauran colony for 2 years and had built up a network of informants among the local population. Now those same humans who had once been eager to trade information for credits or favors simply shrugged when he asked what their people were planning. "They're working on something big," was the most common response he received. When pressed for details, the humans would just smile and change the subject or suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. It was maddening for an intelligence operative who had spent decades learning to read the subtle tells that revealed what other species were thinking. The human industrial output had somehow increased despite their complete isolation. From galactic trade networks, long-range sensors showed massive construction projects on worlds throughout human space, but the energy signatures were scrambled by some kind of interference field that made detailed analysis impossible. Supply ships moved between human systems on schedules that suggested careful coordination, but their cargo manifests were encrypted beyond anything the Naga had seen before. Captain Roy Matthews stood in the command center of Luna Station, watching the largest military buildup in human history take shape around him. Manufacturing plants that had produced civilian goods for export to alien worlds had been retooled overnight to churn out weapons and ship components. The orbital shipyards around Earth worked around the clock with construction crews that never seemed to sleep or take breaks. The newly formed Human War Council coordinated efforts across every colony and outpost with an efficiency that surprised even Roy, who had served in the Earth Defense Corps for 20 years. Politicians who had spent decades arguing about budgets and jurisdiction suddenly found themselves working together toward a common goal. Corporate executives who had been cutthroat competitors began sharing resources and technology without hesitation. What impressed Roy most was how quickly the civilian population had adapted to their new reality. There had been no panic when the isolation began, and no demands to negotiate with the aliens who had rejected them. Instead, there was a quiet determination that reminded him of old stories about humanity's early wars when entire nations had mobilized for survival. Dr. Amy Carter wiped the sweat from her forehead as she studied the readouts from the latest test in her laboratory deep beneath the surface of Mars. The Terran Research Initiative had been given unlimited funding and access to every piece of alien technology humanity had acquired over the past decade. What they had accomplished in just 3 months would have taken most species centuries to develop. The breakthrough had come when Amy realized that humans had been approaching galactic technology all wrong. They had been trying to copy alien designs instead of understanding the underlying principles and improving on them. Once her team stopped treating alien science like gospel and started asking why things worked the way they did, the advances came rapidly. The first successful test of their new propulsion system had sent shockwaves through the Sol system that were detected as far away as Proxima Centauri. The energy output was unlike anything seen before in human space, and the gravitational distortion suggested capabilities that should not have been possible with current technology. Omi looked at the prototype device humming quietly in its containment field and smiled. The aliens had made a serious mistake when they decided to isolate humanity. They had given humans the motivation and the freedom to develop without any restrictions or oversight. What they would face when humanity emerged from isolation would be nothing like what they expected. Meanwhile, in the depths of space, human survey ships had found something that changed everything about their long-term planning. The ancient ruins on a dead world in the Tau Ceti system contained technology that made even the most advanced alien civilizations look primitive. More importantly, the ruins contained detailed records of a galactic war that had ended 10,000 years ago. Commander Nick Stone studied the translated files with growing amazement. The species that built these ruins had faced a coalition of alien races that demanded their submission or destruction. The parallels to humanity's current situation were impossible to ignore. What fascinated Nick even more was how the war had ended and what had happened to both sides afterward. Back in the Galactic Assembly emergency, sessions were being called with increasing frequency as reports filtered in from intelligence networks throughout human space. The Altarian Empire's spy satellites detected massive fleet movements, but the ships themselves seemed to phase in and out of normal space in ways that defied understanding. The Zephyrian monitoring stations reported energy signatures that suggested weapons testing on a scale that made their own military exercises look like children playing with toys. Chancellor Vexthul found himself fielding increasingly worried communications from member species who were beginning to question the wisdom of forcing humanity into isolation. The trade guilds were complaining about lost profits from the human markets. The research institutes wanted access to human scientific advances that intelligence reports suggested were far beyond anything previously seen. Even the military advisors were expressing concerns about what humanity might be preparing in secret. The most disturbing reports came from the frontier worlds near human space. Long-range sensors detected construction projects that dwarfed anything in recorded galactic history. Entire asteroid belts were being converted into something, but the purpose remained unclear. The energy requirements for whatever humans were building suggested industrial capacity that should not have been possible for a species that had only joined galactic civilization a decade earlier. When pressed for recommendations on how to respond to these developments, the Assembly's military committee could only suggest continued monitoring. No one wanted to send ships into human space to investigate directly. The memory of Ambassador Morrison's final words echoed in too many minds for comfort. The last official Communication from human space had come through an automated beacon that broadcast the same message on all frequencies once per day. The voice was calm and professional, but the words sent chills through every alien who heard them. Humanity thanks the galaxy for teaching us exactly who our friends are. We won't forget the lesson. As the months passed and the silence from human space continued, the galactic community began to understand that they had made a terrible miscalculation. They had expected humanity to beg for readmission to galactic society, or to fade into obscurity on some remote world. Instead, they had awakened something that was growing stronger and more capable with each passing day. The galaxy had demanded that humanity be caged for the safety of all civilized species. Soon they would discover what happened when you tried to cage a species that had never learned to submit to anyone. The attack began at exactly 0600 Galactic Standard Time across 23 star systems simultaneously. There had been no warning broadcasts, no ultimatums delivered through diplomatic channels, and no demands for surrender. One moment, the targeted alien systems were going about their normal business, and the next moment, human warships were tearing through their defenses like they were made of paper. Admiral Pete Collins watched from the bridge of the UHSS Retribution as his fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Corithian stronghold system. The enemy had clearly been expecting some kind of human response eventually, because their defensive platforms were fully powered, and their patrol fleets were positioned in textbook formations. What they had not expected were ships that seemed to bend reality around them. The Retribution and her sister ships looked nothing like the human vessels the galaxy had seen before. Their hulls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and energy readings suggested power outputs that should have been impossible for ships of their size. When the Corithian defense fleet moved to intercept them, their weapons passed through empty space where the human ships had been moments before. Pete smiled grimly as he watched the enemy formation break apart in confusion. The phase drive technology that Dr. Carter's team had developed allowed human ships to slip in and out of normal space at will. They could appear inside enemy formations, deliver devastating attacks, and vanish again before return fire could be targeted. It was like fighting ghosts that could shoot back. "Target the command ship," Pete ordered his weapons officer. "Let's show them what happens when you try to cage humans." The Retribution's main guns fired beams of coherent energy that punched through the Corithian flagship's shields like they were not even there. The alien vessel broke apart in a cascade of explosions that lit up the darkness between the stars. Around the system, similar scenes were playing out as human ships systematically dismantled defenses that had protected Corithian space for centuries. On the surface of the primary world, Colonel Rita Barnes led her Marines in an assault that would become legendary among human forces. The Corithian defenders had prepared for a conventional ground war with trenches and fortified positions that could withstand orbital bombardment. What they faced instead were soldiers whose equipment made them nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Rita watched energy bolts bounce harmlessly off her armor as she advanced through the enemy defensive line. The suit she wore was based on technology found in the ancient ruins that Commander Stone had discovered. It did not just deflect attacks, but absorbed the energy and redirected it to increase the wearer's speed and strength. The harder the enemy fought, the more powerful the human soldiers became. Behind her, the Marine assault force moved with coordination that seemed impossible for individual soldiers. Each trooper knew exactly where their squad mates were and what they were doing without any radio communication. The enemy commanders found their carefully planned defensive strategies falling apart as human forces responded to their tactics before orders could even be given. The Corithian fortress world that had never fallen to any attacker in over 1,000 years of warfare surrendered after 6 hours of fighting. The planetary governor transmitted his unconditional surrender, along with a request that human forces show mercy to his civilian population. Rita accepted the surrender, but made it clear that any future resistance would be met with consequences the Corithians would not enjoy. At the same time, Commander Nick Stone was demonstrating the capabilities of humanity's stealth technology against the supposedly impregnable Zephyrian home defense grid. His ships had been in the system for hours before the first attack, watching enemy positions and recording defensive patterns. When they finally revealed themselves, it was by appearing inside the protection of the planetary shields that the Zephyrian commanders had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that enemy forces would have to fight their way through multiple layers of protection to reach the inner system. Nick's forces simply bypassed those defenses entirely by using technology the aliens did not know existed. Their monitoring systems never detected the human ships until weapons fire began tearing their installations apart. What truly shocked the Zephyrian military leadership was how easily their most advanced weapons were countered. Energy beams that could cut through asteroid-sized targets were absorbed and redirected by human ships that seemed to learn from each attack. Missiles that used the most sophisticated guidance systems ever developed were jammed by countermeasures that appeared to predict their target selection algorithms. The most terrifying moment for the alien defenders came when the legendary Veiltar arrived to assist their allies. The ethereal beings had never been defeated in direct combat, because their psychic abilities allowed them to control the minds of enemy forces. When they attempted to use these powers against the human Marines, they discovered something that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. The mental assault that had broken the will of countless alien species simply had no effect on the human soldiers. The Marines continued their advance without even seeming to notice the psychic attack that should have left them helpless. Rita's forces moved through Veiltar positions while the supposedly invincible aliens retreated in panic for the first time in their recorded history. Back on the Retribution, Pete received status reports from human forces across the galaxy and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Every target had fallen ahead of schedule, and enemy resistance was collapsing faster than the most optimistic projections had suggested. The species that had spent years dismissing humans as primitive mammals were learning exactly how wrong they had been. The technological gap between human and alien forces was becoming more apparent with each engagement. Weapons that the galaxy considered state-of-the-art were easily defeated by defensive systems that human engineers had developed in just a few months. Ships that had dominated space lanes for decades found themselves outmaneuvered by vessels that seemed to operate outside the normal laws of physics. Emergency broadcasts flooded the galactic communication networks as system after system fell to human forces. The beings who had once voted to relocate humanity to a cage were now begging their own governments for protection from the species they had underestimated so completely. The Carithian High Command sent desperate messages to every ally they could contact, warning that humanity had somehow leaped ahead by centuries in military technology. The Zephyrian Chancellor, who had presided over humanity's expulsion from the Assembly, found himself evacuating his own homeworld as human forces approached the capital system. Most disturbing to the alien leadership was how precisely human forces struck their targets. Critical infrastructure was destroyed while civilian areas remained untouched. Military installations were reduced to rubble while hospitals and schools stood undamaged mere blocks away. The accuracy suggested intelligence networks that had been observing alien activities for months, or even years before the attack began. As reports reached the emergency session of the Galactic Assembly, the scope of humanity's transformation became clear. The species they had dismissed as too aggressive and unpredictable had become something far more dangerous. They had become efficient and unstoppable. The galaxy had created exactly the enemy they had claimed to fear, and now that enemy was coming for them all. The emergency session of the Galactic Assembly convened on a remote space station after the Grand Chambers on Nexus Prime fell to human forces in less than 4 hours. Representatives from 36 species gathered in whatever ships they could find as their homeworlds either surrendered or evacuated their populations to deep space. The proud civilizations that had ruled the galaxy for millennia were now refugees fleeing from the species they had tried to cage. Chancellor Vex Thol of the Zephyrians looked nothing like the confident leader who had presided over humanity's expulsion just months earlier. His robes were torn from his hasty evacuation, and his normally pristine appearance showed the strain of watching his people's empire crumble in a matter of weeks. When he called the session to order, his voice cracked with barely controlled panic. "We must unite our remaining forces," he declared to the assembled aliens, who looked as desperate as he felt. "The humans cannot be allowed to continue this rampage across civilized space. Their aggression threatens every peaceful species in the galaxy." The Altarian military commander, who had arrived with a fleet of refugee ships, laughed bitterly at the Chancellor's words. "Peaceful species? We voted to relocate an entire civilization to a prison planet and you call that peaceful? The humans are simply showing us what real aggression looks like, despite the arguments and recriminations. The Great Coalition was formed within hours because none of the surviving alien governments had any other choice. Ancient enemies put aside centuries of conflict to face the human threat together. The Naga Collective contributed their stealth technology, while the Vrex offered their swarm tactics, and the Granite Folk provided heavy weapons that could crack planetary cores. The combined fleet that assembled at the Kepler 442 system was the largest military force in recorded galactic history. Over 10,000 warships from dozens of species created defensive formations around fortified platforms that had been built to withstand attacks from entire star fleets. Overlapping shield generators and automated defense grids turned the system into what military analysts called an impregnable fortress. General Chris Morgan received the Coalition's ultimatum while reviewing tactical reports aboard his flagship in the Outer Rim territories. The message demanded humanity's immediate surrender, the dismantling of all advanced weapons, and acceptance of permanent supervision by a galactic peacekeeping force. The alien leaders promised that humans would be treated fairly under the new arrangement and allowed to maintain limited self-governance. Chris read the message twice before deleting it, without bothering to respond. Instead, he sent a single-word reply that would become famous throughout human space: no. The Battle of Kepler 442 began when human scout ships appeared at the edge of the system and began scanning the Coalition defenses. The alien commanders felt confident as they watched the small force of human vessels approach their massive fleet. Even with their advanced technology, the humans would surely be overwhelmed by sheer numbers and firepower. That confidence lasted exactly 47 minutes. Captain Helen Brooks commanded the human advance force that demonstrated capabilities the aliens had not seen in their previous encounters. Her ships did not just phase in and out of normal space, but seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When Coalition forces fired their weapons, the human vessels absorbed the energy and used it to power systems that defied every law of physics the galaxy thought it understood. The aliens watched in horror as their most powerful weapons actually made the human ships stronger instead of damaging them. Planet-killer beams that could crack moons were redirected back at their own forces with twice the original power. Missiles that should have destroyed entire fleets were caught in some kind of energy field and launched back at their creators. Helen's squadron moved through the Coalition formations like they were not even there. Ships that had been in one location would suddenly appear behind enemy lines, while their previous position showed no trace they had ever existed. The alien commanders found their tactical displays showing impossible readings as human forces seemed to be in multiple places at the same time. The breakthrough came when human ground forces led by Sergeant Dale Tucker stormed the main command station that coordinated the entire defensive grid. The alien defenders had prepared for siege warfare with supplies to last months and weapons that could hold off armies. What they faced instead were soldiers who seemed immune to everything the galaxy could throw at them. Dale walked through a corridor filled with Naga poison gas without even putting on his helmet. The toxins that could kill most life forms in seconds had no effect on his enhanced biology. When cornered, Vrex soldiers released clouds of acid that should have dissolved his armor, but instead seemed to make it stronger. The psychological impact on the alien defenders was more devastating than any weapon. Behind him, his Marine unit moved with coordination that made the alien commanders question everything they knew about individual combat. Each soldier seemed to know what their squad mates were thinking and planning, without any visible communication. When one Marine was targeted by multiple enemies, the others would respond to the threat before the attack even began. The Coalition's secret weapon was their recently developed quantum disruptors that were supposed to tear apart matter at the atomic level. When they fired these devices at the human forces, the beams simply disappeared into some kind of energy field that surrounded each soldier. Dale and his men did not even slow down as weapons that should have erased them from existence failed to have any effect. The fortress system that was supposed to be impregnable fell in 18 hours. The Coalition fleet that represented the combined military might of 36 species was either destroyed or captured by human forces that seemed to treat the battle like a training exercise. Alien crews who had survived the engagement reported that human soldiers acted more like they were annoyed by the resistance than challenged by it. News of the defeat spread through the remaining alien territories faster than the human advance fleets. Species that had ruled their sectors of space for thousands of years suddenly faced the reality that they were not the apex predators they had believed themselves to be. Refugee fleets began evacuating core worlds as panic spread through populations that had never known defeat. The wanderer nomad ships that had remained neutral throughout the conflict sent messages, offering to serve as intermediaries between humanity and the remaining alien governments. Their ancient fleet commanders had seen enough wars to recognize when one side held an overwhelming advantage. They wanted to be on the winning side before the shooting stopped. Admiral Pete Collins stood on the bridge of the Retribution as his expanded fleet prepared to advance toward the galactic core, systems where the last organized resistance was attempting to make a stand. Intelligence reports indicated that several species were preparing to use forbidden weapons that had been banned for centuries because of their destructive potential. Pete almost felt sorry for them. The aliens still did not understand that humanity had moved beyond their comprehension of warfare. Every weapon they possessed, every tactic they employed, every defense they constructed was based on principles that human science had surpassed months ago. They were fighting yesterday's war against tomorrow's enemy. The species that had sought to cage humanity were learning what it meant to be prey. And the humans were just getting started with their education. The surrender came not as a single declaration, but as a cascade of desperate transmissions from alien governments across the galaxy. Species that had once commanded vast territories now begged for mercy from whatever remote stations or refugee ships they could access. The Corithian Empire offered to pay tribute in exchange for the survival of their remaining colonies. The Zephyrian Republic promised to share all their scientific knowledge if humans would allow their people to return to their homeworlds. President Carol West sat in her office in the rebuilt White House reading the flood of capitulation messages that arrived hourly from former enemies. 3 months ago, she had been Earth's trade representative, trying to negotiate better deals for human merchants. Now she found herself leading a species that had become the dominant military power in known space almost overnight. The transformation still amazed her. When the human delegation walked out of the Galactic Assembly, the entire species had somehow unified in a way that historians would study for centuries. Political parties that had spent decades fighting each other began working toward common goals. Corporations that had been bitter rivals started sharing resources and technology. Even criminal organizations had contributed to the war effort by providing intelligence networks and smuggling routes. The emergency session of what remained of the Galactic Assembly convened on a mining station in the outer territories far from any major population centers. The grand chambers where aliens had once voted to cage humanity were now serving as offices for human administrators who were surprisingly gentle in their occupation duties. The same beings who had dismissed humans as too dangerous for civilized society now waited nervously for permission to speak to their new overlords. Jake Morrison entered the makeshift assembly hall, wearing the same simple suit he had worn during his years as human ambassador. The irony was not lost on anyone present that he now sat at the head of the chamber where he had once been humiliated and threatened with relocation. The surviving alien representatives watched him with expressions that ranged from fear to desperate hope. "The war is over," Jake announced in the same calm voice he had used during diplomatic negotiations, back when humanity had been the one asking for favors. "Human forces have secured control of all major systems, and resistance has ceased throughout the galaxy. Now we must discuss what comes next." The Altarian delegate, who had once been one of the more reasonable voices in the old assembly, raised a trembling hand to ask for permission to speak. Jake nodded, and the elderly alien stood on unsteady legs before addressing the chamber. "What are your terms for our surrender? Will you relocate us to designated systems as we attempted to do to your people? Will you restrict our movement and trade as we did to yours?" Jake was quiet for a long moment while he considered his response. The human military commanders had prepared detailed occupation plans that would have placed severe restrictions on alien activities for the next century. The industrial leaders wanted access to alien resources and labor that would fuel human expansion for generations. Even some political advisors had suggested that turnabout was fair play, and the aliens should experience the same treatment they had planned for humanity. Instead, Jake Morrison chose a different path that would define humanity's relationship with the galaxy for centuries to come. The United Earth Coalition offers the following terms to all species that accept human authority. First, full recognition of human sovereignty over all disputed territories and trade routes. Second, reparations to be paid over a 50-year period to compensate for 3 years of economic warfare against human interests. Third, establishment of humanity as the final arbiters of all major interspecies disputes going forward. The alien representatives looked confused as they waited for the harsh restrictions and punishments they expected. When Jake continued speaking, their confusion turned to amazement. In return, humanity guarantees the territorial integrity of all alien homeworlds, protection from aggressive neighbors, and fair treatment in all future trade negotiations. We will not relocate any species from their traditional territories, nor will we restrict movement between systems for peaceful purposes. The chamber erupted in a chaos of alien sounds as representatives tried to process what they were hearing. The species that had expected to be caged or enslaved were instead being offered protection and partnership. The beings who had voted to isolate humanity were being invited to join a new galactic order based on cooperation rather than fear. Dr. Amy Carter stood in her laboratory on Mars watching the first joint research. Mission prepare for departure. Human and alien scientists who had been enemies weeks earlier were now working together to explore the ancient ruins that had provided the technological foundation for humanity's rapid advancement. The Veiltar researchers who had once considered humans mentally inferior were eager to study the psychic resistance that had made their species immune to mind control. The breakthrough discoveries continued at an accelerating pace as human intuition combined with alien knowledge to unlock secrets that neither species could have found alone. Propulsion systems that could cross the galaxy in hours rather than months. Medical technology that could extend lifespans indefinitely. Energy sources that made scarcity obsolete for any civilization advanced enough to use them properly. Captain Helen Brooks commanded the first mixed species fleet to patrol the Outer Rim territories where pirates and raiders had taken advantage of the chaos following the war. Her crew included former enemies who now served alongside human officers with remarkable efficiency. The Naga stealth specialists worked with human engineers to develop reconnaissance systems that could track threats across entire sectors. Corithian tactical experts shared their knowledge of defensive strategies that had protected their worlds for centuries. The most remarkable transformation occurred among the species that had been most vocal about the human threat. The Traders Guild that had once lobbied for economic sanctions against humanity now competed fiercely for contracts to supply human expansion efforts. The research institutes that had dismissed human science as primitive began offering exchange programs that sent their best minds to study at Earth universities. Ambassador Jake Morrison walked through the corridors of the rebuilt Galactic Assembly Building on Nexus Prime, observing the changes that had taken place since humanity's victory. Alien representatives who had once looked at humans with fear and disgust now approached him with requests for assistance in resolving local conflicts. Species that had never spoken to each other directly were working together on projects coordinated by human administrators. The final scene that would be remembered by historians took place 6 months after the end of the war when a new crisis arose. The Peaceful Harmony Collective had been accused by their neighbors of developing weapons technology without proper authorization. The charges sounded familiar to anyone who remembered humanity's treatment by the old assembly. The Harmony ambassador stood before the reconvened galactic representatives looking as lost and frightened as Jake Morrison had felt during those dark months when humanity faced isolation and relocation. The small alien shifted nervously as accusations were leveled and sanctions were proposed by species that had learned nothing from recent history. Jake caught the ambassador's eye from his position at the head of the chamber and gave a slight nod. The message was clear and unmistakable. Under the new galactic order, no species would face the Assembly's judgment alone. Humanity remembered what it felt like to stand friendless before hostile powers and would ensure that no other civilization experienced that fear. The galaxy had watched in terror as humans stormed out of the Assembly in defiance of their judgment. Now they watched in awe as humanity chose to return, not as conquerors seeking revenge but as protectors ensuring that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. The species that had tried to cage humanity had instead created the guardians they never knew the galaxy needed.